Hi, good evening to everyone. Yeah, thank you for joining. If you have any questions from previous sessions, please do ask. We'll wait for another minute max and then we can start. You can drop your questions in the chat box or you can simply unmute yourself and then ask me. Why lions live in group, that graphical representation. Uh, okay, so if I remember correctly, that graph. Let me just see if I can draw it here. So it kind of represents uh, the group size, right? Group size versus survivorship, right? So as the group size increases, the survivorship increases after a while. Uh, Survivorship or the benefits. If I'm not, I don't remember that exactly. I think so. What happens is as the group size increases, the benefits that you receive from the group is increased. Let's say, for example, if the lion goes on to hunt alone, so its success rate might be very less. Like let's say, for example, here, like as represented here. But if two lions go in the group, you might have higher amount of success, like the percentage, their ability to capture the prey. And similarly it might also increase, like let's say three individuals, but after certain number, so that either the value either plateaus, that means there is no further added benefit, just three lions are enough to capture the whatever the prey that the system has. But sometimes the other benefits that they receive, like if let's say three lions are there, and then they can have one third of the prey. But if there are six lions, let's say this represents six lions, and then the share each lion gets from the kill reduces drastically, right? Similarly it reduces, it goes on like eight lions or something. The numbers are not exact representation, but just to give the idea. Okay, so there is an upper limit on how long if you stay in the group, you still receive benefits, and you don't have loss of staying in the group. So that's what the graph is representing for the lines in that case. Okay, is that clear, or could you understand something from that? The other graph, can you please tell me what was the other graph? I don't remember. It has been also a long time ago for me. What was the graph trying to say? If that is there, I can try to help you with that. Or let me see if I can. How to just check. It might take a while if I had to open and check it. So if you have idea, you let me know. Or the other thing that we can do is finish today's session and then I can open that video and that class. I can have a look at it and then I can in, at the time we can discuss about that. Is that okay? Okay, sure. So let's start. Uh, so last week we were discussing about ecological interactions. Now, how these interactions are present in the ecosystem. This week, we will go over that. So, food chains are such an example of how different species interact and then how they are present in the system there. So, this is a simple, very simple food chain where you have plants that plants are eaten, consumed by grasshoppers are consumed by frogs are consumed by snakes, and snakes are eaten by some big raptorial birds. Okay, since the much of the energy is produced by plants, these are called as producers, and none of the other individuals or the species present in this chain can't produce food for themselves. They are referred to as consumers because they get the food or the requirements covered from consuming others, either it could be producers or it could be other consumers. Okay, and then producers also can be referred to as autotrophs. Auto means self, self energy. Auto is self. Trophs refers to, I think, how they produce food, and consumers can also be referred to as heterotrophs, right? And so, can someone, yeah, can someone tell me the differences between photoautotrophs and chemoautotrophs? What do these terms say, and where do we see these photo and chemoautotrophs? Since very few of you are here, feel free to interact freely so that you can get most out of the class. Photoautotrophs versus chemoautotrophs. I can wait for another minute so that if you're typing it down, you can take your time, or feel free to unmute yourself and then answer it. Okay, in that case, I will also just go ahead. Since I was saying earlier, autotrophs are, they produce their own food, and then if you remember, how do plants produce food? They produce food using photosynthesis, using energy from sunlight. So photoautotrophs are those organisms that use sunlight as a source of energy. Yes. Thank you, Bala. Organisms produce their own food with the help of light are called photo or chemo. Bala, you just said autotrophs. That's organisms that produce their own food. Okay. Photo. Yes, you're right. And what about chemoautotrophs? If you want to answer, I can wait for a while, or if you want me to go ahead, I can go ahead. Okay. So, as I was saying, as Bala has also has pointed it out, photo they use photoautotrophs use sunlight for producing food. Like some of those examples could be plants. Most of the plants use, or almost all the plants use, energy from sunlight. Algae and even some bacteria can use that. And chemoautotrophs, or as if you might have come across this word chemo refers to using chemicals. Here, uh, there are some bacteria that are specialized in using the energy that is released during some chemical reactions. They use that energy to reduce carbon dioxide and to make organic molecules, and then these bacteria then bring, when they are consumed by other organisms, they are brought into the food chain as such. So as I was saying, sunlight they use sunlight to reduce carbon dioxide into organic molecules, and these are further assimilated into the tissues, and then they are you know put down into the food chain. While chemoautotrophs, use chemicals, like for example hydrogen sulfide is one of the such chemicals they use. They reduce it, and then when that energy that is produced during this reduction is used for making up the organic molecules. And much of these chemoautotrophs tend to stay, close to underwater volcanoes or volcanoes generally, because that's where you get huge amounts of these type of chemicals which these organisms can use for generating energy. Okay, so that's a major difference. So they use sunlight energy from the sunlight, while chemoautotrophs use chemicals. And food chain, uh, the example that we have seen earlier is a simple example of a food chain. And then there are multiple types of food chain depending upon how, what is the starting point the chain is, or the primary source of energy in the food chain. So first one is grazing food chain. uh, Grazing food chain, as we have seen earlier, where there are the herbivores graze on, you know plants or grasses, or the primary producers directly, and then thus bring this energy into the food, into the subsequent food chain. While detritus food chain, where the dead leaves of the plants or the producers are consumed by primary consumers or detritivores, basically uh, most worms, some beetles, some bugs do this, and then which are subsequently, put up into food chain. So there's an interesting thing. So if you see the representation, the grazing food chain is little longer, and the traders food chain is little smaller. Okay, can anybody guess why the traders food chains? So this is a pattern that is found, in uh, in nature. Like grazing food chains are generally larger than compared to detritus food chain. Can any of you think of possible reasons why this could be happening in nature? Why detritus food chains are, smaller compared to grazing food chains? So I hope you understood the question. So just referring to grazing food chains versus detritus food chains, and saying in nature we observe smaller detritus food chains when compared to grazing food chains, which tends to be relatively larger than detritus food chains. Okay, so let me go ahead and answer it. So what happens is the amount of energy, that is available in the detritus is much more less compared to, when it started in grazing food chain. That's one of the reasons that detritus food chains are tend to be relatively small compared to grazing food chains. Okay, and yeah, so here what we have been seeing is mostly linear relationship between, these organisms. So it's like the plants is just eaten by this grasshopper, the grasshopper is just eaten by frogs, frogs eaten by snakes, snake eaten by the birds. But this is not what we, observe in nature, because sometimes, you can see, a bird directly eating on frog, frog sometimes eating on plant, or snake eating some other insect, or some entirely new organism starts eating on snake, on frog. So there are a wide variety of possibilities. So this simplistic form of representation might not be the true form of what is happening. So that is what food webs tries to represent. So the complex interlinking between multiple species across multiple levels. Okay, so that's what food web does. So each level is called as a trophic level, if you remember. So the first ones where the much of the energy is produced or harvested from sunlight is producers, followed by consumers, and then so okay, and then we can name the consumers based on the position in the food chain or the food web. So if they directly feed on the producer, they can be called as primary consumer, and something that feeds on primary consumer will be a secondary consumer, and something that feeds on secondary consumer could be tertiary, that feeds on tertiary could be quaternary consumer. So uh, let me ask you this question. Please try to answer this in the chat box. So, which of these consumers do herbivores belong to? So, which do we refer primary consumers, secondary consumers, or tertiary or quaternary consumers to be herbivores? So, which degree of which position in this we refer the herbivores are present as? I hope you understood the question. So, basically, which among these consumer levels do we refer them as herbivores? And simultaneously, if you want to answer for carnivores, sure, go ahead. Answer for carnivores also. Okay. Someone said primary consumers. And if someone wants to answer about carnivores, you can also please write down about carnivores also. Also. Okay. Yes, you guys are right. The primary consumers are referred to as herbivores in because they directly consume the producer, which tends to be mostly plants. Okay, and what do you think about carnivores? Where do they belong? So we know this is not a carnivore. This is not a carnivore. Then do we call the others as carnivores, or which one do we call as carnivores? Secondary, tertiary, and quaternary consumers are all carnivores. Yes, you are right. Yeah, most of all of them can be classified as carnivores if you just the definition of being a carnivore is just consuming the other another consumer instead of producer. But if they tend to eat the producer also in the food in a food web, they can be omnivores, because omnivores eat both plant-based food and animal-based food. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah. And then you know yeah, and then similarly decomposes are those that are involved decomposing and then returning whatever the matter that is passed on across these different consumers to back to this resource pool. Okay, so yeah, that's what a food web tries to represent. And ecological pyramids. So what do you think comes under ecological pyramids, and how do you think they help us understand species food web, let's say, or food chains? Have you heard of this term ecological pyramids? I hope most of you might have heard. uh, Pyramids are basically, it's a graphical representation of the shape of a pyramid, in the shape of a pyramid, sorry. Yes. uh, which can be either representing the biomass or the energy or the number of individuals of an organism at each trophic level. So if so we have called each of these as individual trophic level. So if we simply make a pyramid on saying which also how many, how many individuals are there, so that can be also that can be, pyramid of numbers. Or so those all things, or the number of species present, or the number of, you know what's the biomass of producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers. If you plot them, if you tries to represent them in a graphical format, they can be called as ecological pyramids. So, so as I was saying earlier, there can be, number of pyramids. So pyramid is generally upright. Basically, that means the base is much more broader. As you go to the tip, it gets narrow in terms of when you look at pyramids of numbers. Here it says the producers are much more large in number, and the herbivores that depend on these producers tends to be in smaller numbers, and the consumer that, you know consumes on these herbivores, or the carnivore that eats these herbivores, tends to be, in very few number. In this example, as you can see, the grass, if you look at the grass, that's present in huge numbers. If you go and individually count each individual grass, which might be a little daunting task too, but you can count relatively cheetahs very better, because they are present in relatively less number, supported by the huge amount of grass. And this number of cheetahs can be, sustain, specific number of tigers in the population. So the pyramid of numbers for this, for this food chain can be, upright pyramid. Okay, so the producers are there are lot many number of producers, but the as you go, the consumers tend to decrease. Do you think this pyramid gets inverted? That means, what I mean to say inverted means there are very few, producers, but huge number of consumers. Do you know, or if you have any examples of where this might happen, if it happens in the first case? Do you think it is possible that, few producers sustaining huge number of consumers? In a tree ecosystem? Okay, anybody wants to add? As it is possible, yes. Do you have any other example? Someone said about tree ecosystem being one of the example, and any more examples you want to point out? uh, okay, let me explain what happens in a tree ecosystem. So yes, the pyramid of numbers can be inverted in some ecosystems. So what happens in a tree ecosystem is, like, you have, one tree, and the number of, if you look at the number of caterpillar, if you count the number of caterpillars that feed on the leaves of the tree, you can have, a lot of caterpillars. And then, and if you count the number of insects that feed on those caterpillars, you can have, lot more numbers of caterpillars feeding insects that feed on these caterpillars. So the pyramid of numbers can also be inverted. So it happens mostly in case of, parasites. Okay, similarly, this example, as I was saying, grass, it, you know, it the number of herbivores it can support, might be higher. And then if it's very nutritious grass, then it can support a greater number of herbivores. But it can be, I'm just give the example of cheetal, but if you could think of caterpillars, it's also possible in a tree ecosystem. And then if you count the number of parasites on each cheetal or sambar or the herbivores, you will find very number of parasites like ticks or fleas. And then if you find the hyperparasites like the bacteria that stays on these sticks and fleas, you will find much more numbers. So the pyramid of numbers can also be inverted, but it happens mostly in the way, if you go into parasites point of view, you get this huge increase in numbers because each herbivore can harbor a lot number of parasites. Okay. uh, Biomass. What do you think? The pyramid of biomass, will it be upright or inverted? Okay. Pyramid of biomass will be upright because the biomass that can be sustained by the producers and the primary consumers tends to reduce as you go across the trophic levels. Okay, this I will come to again why it happens in the subsequent slides. Okay. And so since I was talking about biomass, let me come to this term as standing crop. So this, if it inherently tries to say standing, it's like the what is present at that moment. Crop is like the amount of whatever you are measuring. So it's generally looked at, the weight or quantity of organisms present in an area at a given moment in time. Or it can be at a specific trophic you can measure the standing crop at a specific trophic level also. Like, for example, if you look at this representation, uh, you know uh, in the kingdom of life, 70 gigatons of carbon is present in bacteria, so relative biomass. Similarly, 450 gigatons of carbon is stored in plants. Okay, so if since you are measuring here at a time, what is the amount of carbon present in plants? So this can be called as a standing crop. So it depends on if you can measure it for across trophic levels also. Okay, and yeah, I was saying because the producers, the biomass of the producers tends to be much more larger, and then the consumers decreases because of this thing called ecological efficiency. So it is basically nothing but when the consumer consumes a producer or another consumer, so what amount of energy is transferred from one trophic level to another trophic level? That's what is basically ecological efficiency. How efficiently the energy is transferred. So it is estimated that somewhere around 10% of the energy is transferred across trophic levels. Okay. Yeah. Okay, for example, here, if you go back again to this upright pyramid, let's say, for example, grass, you know, in an area, there is 100 joules of energy that is, or let's say 1,000 joules of energy that is sequestered by this grass. And when a cheetal consumes that grass, it will become according to the 10% efficiency rule, it will become 100 joules. That is what is present in all the cheetahs present in that area. And when it goes against the tigers, it will be 10. So there is 10% loss, sorry, 10% of energy is transferred from across trophic levels. So basically 90% of it is lost at each trophic level. Okay, so that brings us to the pyramid of energy, because you know why does this loss happens? This loss happens is because mainly due to the release of the energy as heat. That's one of the primary reasons, but there are other reasons, because whatever we have consumed, the primary consumers consumed from the plants, for example, they might not assimilate each and every one of it. They can, they defecate, they respire, they, and much of these things take off, much of the chunk of the energy is lost in those processes. That's why this 10% passing on is like an approximate. Yeah, so that's why we tend to see most of the times upright pyramids, and then food chains or tends to be much more shorter because of this reason. Okay, I hope this ecological efficiency and then energy pyramid was not confusing. Okay, if it's clear as of now, then I will move on a little bit into trophic level stuff, like trophic cascade. Uh, if someone wants to say what is trophic cascades, what are trophic cascades? What do you think trophic cascade is? Or so okay, trophic cascades is something that refers to organisms present in across different trophic levels. So cascade is a term that you know it refers to how one has an effect on other here, like how one trophic level affects the other trophic levels directly or indirectly. Okay, uh, so trophic level cascades are these are indirect interactions that control most ecosystems, and then these occur especially when predators limit the density or alter the behavior of their prey, and thereby enhance survival of the next lower trophic level. So what happens is there is a predator that limits the density or behavior of the prey, that in turn enhances the increases the survival of the next trophic level that the prey is dependent on. So what does that mean? So let's take a simple trophic level system and then see. So if you look at this, we have just three. Let's assume we have three trophic levels in the system. There's a producer, there's a herbivore, there is a predator. So basically, what does it say is when the predator feeds on this herbivore, it exerts a pressure so that this prey alters its behavior, okay, or their number, and then which indirectly has a positive effect on the producer. Okay, this trend. I will come to that point, Bala, just in a minute. Let me just finish this so that everyone understands this. Then I can come and answer yours. What? Yeah. So basically, the producers is negatively affected by a herbivore when it feeds on it. It destroys the producer or kills it. And similarly, the predator negatively affects herbivore. As predator is negatively affecting herbivore, let's say for example, these grasshoppers come out in the open and eat. Okay, let's say in the daytime, and then the birds tend to come around the daytime and then eat on the grasshoppers. So what happens? The grasshoppers, tend to avoid. Let's say behaviorally, they might start feeding in the night, which gives much time for the plant, to grow or to defend itself. Or the herbivore might altogether leave that patch and then go to a different place or feed for very less time or very little. So, and then that's indirectly helping the plants because they're predated very less. So in that way, the positive effects of the predator happens on the immediately next level trophic level of the herbivore. So this sort of interactions, when you study, you address this concept. You call this concept as trophic cascades. Okay. uh, so Bala wrote, if the strength of primary consumers became a problem to the producers, then secondary consumers has been introduced in the environment to control the level of primary consumers. So I think are you trying to refer to the wolves example in Yellowstone National Park? Okay, okay. So uh, let me just say, so it's not like introduce you're saying. So that might happen, as a conservation decision. If they want to save a forest or a grassland from heavily grazing, they can introduce some predators that can control the herbivores. But this is what in general happens. So they exert positive pressures, but suddenly if you take off these predators or some of the individuals from these or some of the trophic levels, if you completely remove them, the effects that they have are altered. So that can cause a cascade effect in that trophic level, and then it can create an imbalance in the ecosystems. So there is an example that has happened and is pretty famous for this. So Yellowstone National Park is one of these bigger national parks in North America, USA. So what happened was wolves were hunted to extinction there. Once the wolves were hunted to extinction, their main prey, a species of deer, what it started was, since there was no predator, it started to overgraze and then reduce, grass patches to nothing. So they started feeding on everywhere, everything. And since there was no one to control them, this strength. Yeah, sorry for that. So yeah, I was just saying, in Yellowstone National Park, when the the predatory predators, the wolves, are removed from are hunted to extinction, these the deer started heavily grazing on the grass because that's what they do. They had to feed to live. Since there was no predator to control them, they grew. The population grew like anything, and then they started clearing patch. They just wiping off whole areas of grasses. And at the same time, there was this idea to introduce wolves. Once they introduced wolves into that area, the herbivores, which are the deers, here they altered their behavior to not feed in specific patches or to feed very little, and then their numbers started decreasing because the wolves are eating them so much. And then because of the presence of wolves, the producers had a positive effect, because since these herbivores are eating very little or avoiding areas, the grasslands or the grasses grew back like it was earlier times when the wolves were present. So this is what happens, the way the interactions happens, it can happen indirectly also. This is what is explained in trophic cascades. Okay, hope it was little clear. And then there is another study I was referring to earlier in the previous session about the effect of wind turbines on fan-throated lizards. It was done around Bangalore, in these dry areas where wind turbines. Okay, it has this nice three system. So what happened was, because of the wind turbines, there were less number of birds, because the birds of prey, eagles, kites. So because they might hit the wind turbine, they tend to avoid those areas. So because there are because of this, there are sites where there are predatory birds and there are no predatory birds, and then this is the prey. So what this study found out was, you know, if you look at here, wind turbines present and no wind turbines. When there were no wind turbines present, the predatory birds were present in huge numbers, and similarly they were also attacking those lizards much more times whenever they are present when there is no wind turbines. And the lizards are present in very less density when there were no wind turbines than when there are wind turbines, because there are no predators, so they just grew like crazy. So, and this growth of lizards can have negative impact on the next trophic level that they feed on. Basically, if they feed on insects, then they reduce the abundance of insects here, because there's no one to control them and then have a positive effect on them. So since these impacts cascade from one trophic level to another, so these are called as or referred to as trophic cascades. Okay, uh, clear as of now, like, or have a little idea about what trophic cascades are, right? So now let's go into primary production. So primary production is basically the rate at which this primary produces. It can either be plants, it can be bacteria that produces new organic matter, either through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. If you measure the rate, you are trying to measure the production, the amount of production that is happening by these producers. Okay, and there are multiple types of production. Mainly is the gross primary production, or called shortly they are referred. It is referred to as GPP. It is basically the total amount of carbon dioxide fixed by plants per unit time. Okay, so whatever the carbon dioxide it fixes, that is referred to as gross primary production or productivity. While net primary productivity is the amount of production that is allocated for plant structural biomass. It can be leaves, stems, fruits, defenses, much little extent to defenses. So, what happens here is, so plant produces, let's say, uh, let's have this arbitrary term of 100. Okay, 100 100, let's say, since it's amount of carbon dioxide fixed, it's like 100 grams of glucose. Okay, for example. So this is gross primary productivity, and net primary productivity, this is the total amount that it has produced. Okay, but net primary productivity is something different. It says it is what it is allocated for the structural growth of the or of the plant. So it can be, it has to be less than gross primary productivity, because you can't use whatever you have produced entirely, because you respire, you undergo respiration, you dissipate energy as heat. So it will be, npp has to be less than less than gpp, gross primary productivity. So how much less? So basically, if you subtract the respiration, the how much the plant respire, then what you get is net primary productivity. So it can be either, if the, let's say for example, this is the total gpp that plant has produced, and then it has respired, 10 grams. So 90 grams is what is your net primary productivity, or the amount that is allocated for growth or reproduction or whatever. Okay, so yeah, so that is what uh, was, yeah, this is GPP relates to NPP as NPP is equal to GPP minus RA, where RA is the autotrophic respiration, and both of them are expressed at its rates, usually in terms of the carbon currency. So you can express them of, as grams carbon per meter square per hour. How much grams of carbon is assimilated per meter square area per hour, or you can have tons of carbon per hectare per year. So there are, it depends on what's the scale you're looking. If you're looking at just one single plot, then you can say, or for a short duration, you can say, this might be what is happening. But if you're looking at over across the years, then you can say, this much amount per hectare per year is produced. Okay, so how do we measure this primary production? We know that plants produce, and then that's how everything goes on into the food chain or food web. So how do we measure? The first measure is, you cut the plant, you measure it, or there harvest based methods, you harvest the plants or whatever thing that you want to measure. So it's estimates biomass production through periodic measurements of root, stem, leaf, and fruit growth. Let's say for example, you have a plot, you want to measure the primary production of the plot. You go there, above ground primary production is basically whatever is coming up. So you go, time one, you cut down all the plants, what structures that are present above the ground, you wait. After 2 months, you again go, you again cut it, then you measure. So whatever has the value you get a time to is, what the plant has accumulated across 2 months. So that's how you know what's the primary production of that plot for that time. Okay, since the growth over time of all plant tissues within a terrestrial ecosystem is equal to NPV. So that's how you measure, that's one measure of primary production. Now, recently, there is another method where, you measure the rate of photosynthesis. Instead of directly measuring, you indirectly measure the rate of photosynthesis. You can either use, radioactive carbon in lab, or radioactive oxide water in lab, to see how much of this radioactivity is assimilated in the plant or in the field. There are these things called meteorological towers, these tall towers in a field that can measure up uh, carbon dioxide emissions or uptake in a specific area. So how much of the carbon is gone, or how much CO2 is produced in that area this can measure. So you can use these measurements to say, this much amount of primary production has happened in this area, or this much of respiration has happened in this area, and so on. Okay. And similarly, so this is what it says. So this is a study which the amount of net primary productivity that is allocated to standing biomass. So most of the primary productivity is allocated to standing biomass, mostly the stems, little to the roots and leaves. And you can use radioactive methods like I was saying earlier, but these radioactive methods has to be done in lab for individual species. It's little difficult to do it in field. So if you want to use measure it for large amount of area, like for the whole country or inaccessible places, then you can use satellite data. Especially the most popular of the satellite data is, it's called MODIS, Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectroradiometer. This is the satellite that was put up by NASA. So which use different wavelengths of light it captures that is getting reflected from the Earth's surface, and then once you have those wavelengths, you know which wavelengths corresponds to which thing in plants, and then you put up those values, make a model, statistic mathematical modeling, and how those colors change in those things represent how much primary productivity has happened in the area. Okay, so most of these days people tends to use MODIS data, and there are other satellite data also available, but the predominant one is this one. So this is a map of calculated from one such data set, where the darker green areas on land refers to the amount of net primary production that happens per kg per meter square. So especially in Amazon savannas, there is this huge productivity that is happening, and then the blue areas refers to the productivity that happens in oceans. So you can calculate productivity both on land and in oceans. Okay, so yeah, that is NPP and GPP. So basically, generally tend to use NPP because that is what is assimilated. Can someone say what is oligotrophic lake and how is it different from eutrophic lake? Anybody? Oligotrophic versus eutrophic lakes. Okay, then I will go ahead. So oligotrophic lakes are, the one of the main. There are multiple ways to differentiate oligotrophic versus eutrophic lakes, but the main concept, main thing that you look at is the availability of resources or the nutrients present in those lakes. Okay, and then the amount of species it can sustain is also one of the thing, because the nutrients indirectly say about how many species it can sustain. So oligotrophic lakes are have very low availability of nutrients, especially phosphorus and nitrogen, and they can support very low density of plants or phytoplankton. Uh, and you see most species that are have, what are the species that you see in oligotrophic lakes are invertebrate that needs especially high oxygen concentrations. And these oligotrophic lakes tends to be much more steeper, much more colder. Okay, while eutrophic lakes are comparatively shallow, and there are high availability of nutrients, especially phosphorus and nitrogen, and high density of plants and phytoplanktons. This in turn supports huge number of animals. Okay, and huge different types of species. Sorry. Okay, so are these so are these like distinct? No. uh, they can A lake can become a oligotrophic lake can become a eutrophic lake by this process called eutrophication, where which is basically the change in the climatic factors or the characteristics of the lake, because the limiting factors that were limiting the species number, like either it could be temperature or either it could be nutrients, when they are no longer limiting, the lake tends to have excess plant and algal growth that in turn can make it an eutrophic lake. But it's not a short term thing. So in nature, for a natural oligotrophic lake to go to for it to be eutrophic, it can take thousands of years. Okay. For oligotrophic, mesotrophic is the stage where it has intermediate levels of nutrients and plants, and then eutrophic is the extreme stage. And but what humans have been doing are reducing this pace. So this can happen in few years itself, or in some instances you can have it in one couple of years also, when because we have been depositing, especially from urban runoff or agriculture runoff, much of this water ends up in fields, and then they bring with them, sorry, ponds. When they are going to the ponds, they bring with them all these nutrients or fertilizer that we are putting up in the agriculture fields, and then leading to faster eutrophication. So this is a problem for most of the lakes. It's a natural phenomena. That's not a problem. But the thing is, the way it's happening is much more faster. So that's the thing that is of concern. Okay. So oligotrophic, mesotrophic, and eutrophic, and then there are some lakes in extreme cases. Uh, the nutrients are so much abundant that the algal blooms happen, and then it kills off all the vegetation because they blocks of sunlight, and then there is no more much oxygen left in the water. So most of these organisms die, or either the algal blooms produce some toxic chemicals that kills other organisms. So those situations are called hypertrophic, hypereutrophication, or hypereutrophic lakes. So if you look at these pictures, which picture belongs to which category? Oligotrophic, mesotrophic, eutrophic. ABC. Uh, Please do answer in the chat box. I will wait for 2-3 minutes for you guys to answer it. Take your time, think about it. So what differentiates say oligotrophic lake from you know eutrophic lakes versus mesotrophic lakes? B eutrophic lake. Okay. A oligotrophic, B eutrophic, C mesotrophic. Okay, anybody else wants to add? Yeah, yes, you guys are right. So, A is a oligotrophic lake, eutrophic lake. You can call this as a mesotrophic lake because there aren't much algal blooms. So the main difference, most of the oligotrophic lakes are tends to be glacial lakes because the temperatures are so cold and then the nutrients are so poor. So you get very little to no plants in them. So they those type of lakes are oligotrophic lakes. So this is one such lake from Himachal. You might have heard of Chandratal. So it's that lake. So which is very cold. It freezes in winter and very little to very little aquatic plants and insects that sustain them compared to a lake that you see around other places. Okay, so micro versus macronutrients. Does anybody want to say what are these micro and macro nutrients? We can answer in terms with respect to humans or plants. It's not a problem. But if anybody wants to answer that, okay, let me just go ahead. So micro means small or referring to those nutrients that are required by the organism, smaller quantities. I'm sorry, the examples are little written opposite way. And macro are large. The examples here are for large. So these are large or macronutrients, and these are macronutrients. So macronutrients are that are required by the organism for its function in large quantities like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur. These are the building blocks for organic molecules, which is present in each and individual organism, or let's say cells. And while micronutrients are essential, but they are not required in huge quantities. So that's why they are called as micro. Okay, like molybdenum, zinc, chlorine, manganese. You know, yes, yeah, you're right. So, so there's a major difference between the amount of nutrients that are required by individual organisms. So it depends on species to species or organism to organism key which is a macronutrient, which is a macronutrient. But in broader sense, there are some nutrients that are macro for everyone because these are the basic building blocks like carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, nitrogen. Nitrogen is an important components of these proteins. Okay, and similarly, essential elements are these can be either macro or micronutrients which are required by the living organisms for growth, metabolism, and development. Without these, most of this will be hindered. So those elements or the nutrients are referred to as essential elements. So as I was saying earlier, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur are the main essential or some of the essential elements for any organism. Sorry. Yeah. So yeah. let's go to biogeochemical cycles. So can someone say what is a biogeochemical cycle? Okay, let me go on over it slowly. In the meantime, if you are typing, please type it down. I can read and write about it again. So, uh, biogeochemical. So there are three components in this: carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle. Yes, those are the examples of uh, biogeochemical cycles. Nice. So, cyclic process of chemical substrates in the environment. Yes. So yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. So chemical substances. So that's what these it tells about everything. So chemical substances goes in cycles between geochemical and biological objects. Here, biological can be living organisms, and geological stuff. It could be either you know earth, atmosphere, all of this. So since these chemicals are circulated across all these both biological and geological matter, so they are referred to as biogeochemical cycles. The movement and transformation of elements and compounds between living organisms, the atmosphere, and the earth crust. There can be multiple definitions. It's basically trying to explain you what that word actually refers to. Okay, so as someone earlier has pointed, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, water cycle, sulfur cycle. There can be most. There can be many phosphorus cycle. There can be many type of biogeochemical cycles. Uh, I will go across those that are covered in the video like classes. So main thing is one of the important cycle is the nitrogen cycle. You know, uh, so the source can be where is the source of nitrogen? Where is the most amount of nitrogen present in the environment? Anybody wants to take a wild guess? What is the source of nitrogen on Earth? Or let's say, for example, is it the atmosphere? Is it the you know, is it from volcanoes, or is it plants, or is it animals, or is it soil? Which which is a major source of nitrogen? Legumes, plant. Uh, that's not source. That's not what I meant to ask. So what I meant to ask is where is most of the nitrogen located? It's atmosphere. If you remember the composition of air, it's like 76% or some percent of it is of the air is nitrogen. Remember? So yeah. So nitrogen is the major pool of nitrogen is in the atmosphere. So what happens to nitrogen is, as you have pointed out, legumes plant naturally fix the nitrogen and make it available in ammonia or ammonium form, which is what is used by plants for their growth. Or when they are making proteins, nitrogen is an important component, so they can absorb only in these forms, and then they can assimilate and then make them. The other way of is nitrogen fixation by free living bacteria in the soil, or lightning can also fix nitrogen and reduce it to ammonia and ammonia. Okay, and then these are eaten by plants that are produced. When they are eaten by animals, the defecation, or when they die, it just goes back into the soil. And nitrogen is also fixed by industrial processes. especially the famous one of the famous processes is Bosch Haber process. So where you collect the nitrogen and then you reduce it to ammonia and ammonium form. This is what is then it is used as and this reduced form you can use it as urea, one of the reduced form. And then this can also go back into the atmosphere by this process called nitrification and denitrification. There are some bacteria that does this process, and this can go back again into the atmosphere. Okay, that's how this cycle happens. And humans have messed up this cycle by creating this industrial fixation of nitrogen, and put, have introduced a lot of nitrogen into environments. One such thing was eutrophication that we are talking about. Much of this nitrogen flow into lakes leads to eutrophication, and so on. Okay, and another such cycle is this carbon cycle. Okay, uh, so what do you think is the source of carbon, most carbon in the environment? Is it the living organisms, or is the atmosphere, or is it the soil, or fossil fuels, which is the bigger carbon pool or the largest carbon pool? Atmospheric air. Okay. Anybody? Any other guesses? Like which is the source or the largest pool of atmospheric air released from plants? Uh, what are you trying to refer to, Bala? Yeah, I'm not able to understand. Because if you remember, in production they use carbon dioxide to produce glucose. So they basically take carbon dioxide from the air. But what I'm understanding from what you have written is they are released from plants, which is a process that happens, but not in great amount. Okay, so okay, cool. Then glad that you understand what's wrong with that answer. So yeah, the thing is, one of the major pools of carbon is soil. Soil has huge amount of carbon, and obviously the fossil depositions, the living organisms themselves have carbon. And yeah, when you burn those fossil fuels, you emit carbon. The volcanic eruptions also release carbon. Respiration, plant, animal respiration release carbon. And then the only way the carbon can go back into the earth is assimilation by plants and assimilation by phytoplankton and corals that takes these into you know oceans, and then when it is reduced and deposited as calcium carbonate. Without this, most of the carbon dioxide that is released tends to stay in the atmosphere. And then that's one of the primary reasons that is why we are facing the effects of climate change in these years, because much how from the industrial revolution time we have been releasing a lot of carbon dioxide into the air. Okay, and sulfur cycle. Similarly, sulfur, it can either come from ores, fossil fuels, or sulfur deposits in sediments. And then when you when you burn this, it will go as sulfur dioxide into the air, and then they can be deposited as such, or they can come back as acid rain. And some of the sulfates are uptaken by plants, which which goes around in when they are consumed by animals, it goes around in the food web, and then again it will go back into the soil. And water cycle, which is what everyone, each and every one of us knows: evaporation, transpiration, condensation. And then there is groundwater also that is responsible. So there isn't much to say about water cycle, I suppose, because and everyone have us have might have heard of this. Organisms through respiration mostly release water, and then plants do it by transpiration. Okay, and yeah, that's all for today. If you have any questions or regarding the ones that I have covered in this class, if you want me to repeat some of those topics, please let me know before I go and talk about the question that was asked initially about one of you. Thank you. Okay. So in that case, I will go back. I will stop this presentation and go back to the one question that someone has asked initially, and let's see, try to answer it so that you have some, you can go. Okay, just give me a moment. Let me open the slides. So lecture 9 video. Okay, lecture 9. Uh, Afia, can you say what time was it around, so that that can help me find it really quickly? That the question that you asked earlier. Yes, okay, she has left. Looks like. Okay. Uh, then in that case, we'll stop here. Okay. I will be ending this meeting. Thank you. Thank you for joining. Uh, Hope to see you in the next session.